Hello there, and welcome to the 2022 Data Protection Strategies and Initiatives webcast. My name is Jason Buffington. I'm Vice President of Solution Strategy at Veeam. You can reach me on Twitter as JBuff, J-B-U-F-F. With me, as always, is my friend and colleague. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Jason, great to be here with you. Great to be with everyone. I'm Dave Russell, Vice President of Enterprise Strategy in Veeam. Both Jason and I are in the office of the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, and you can reach me at Backup Dave on Twitter, as well as LinkedIn.
And if you want to email us, you can hit both of us as strategicresearch@veeam.com. Dave, I am so excited to share the results of this project. The report just published earlier this week, right? And as we believe, this is the largest independent data protection research project ever published by any analyst firm, by any vendor. Nearly 3,400 IT professionals, IT decision makers, 28 different countries. Almost all the respondents were from organizations with greater than 1,000 employees. Dave, this has been a massive project for what, like 7 months and counting?
Yeah, it really is. And it should mention that both Jason and I have been in the backup industry for in excess of 30 years. At some point, I think we're going to stop counting. But last year, meaning 2021, when we issued the 2021 Data Protection Trends Report, we had 3,000 responses globally, and we thought that was the largest in the history of the industry. Now, Jason, I'll just slightly round up to 3,400 or 3,400. It's more larger, if that's even a correct phraseology. And hats off to you and our colleague Julie Webb, who's been a major contributor to driving this project for, as you say, well over half a year.
Yeah, she's been leading research at Veeam for about 8 years now. You and I just get some of the credit, having been here now 4 years each. So in this particular project, some of the things that we're going to share with folks, for the last several years, the Data Protection Trends Report has covered the top headlines and macro trends. We cover digital transformation, IT modernization. Dave, I know you're going to talk about that in a little bit. Infrastructure strategies, where does hybrid fit in the mix? Really looking and measuring what downtime and data look like, and also where does the cloud fit in both production and protection trends. But this year, Dave, we got a chance to actually add 3 new solution scenario categories around containers, around cyber remediation, and with BCDR. Look, for the folks that are listening today, if you can't wait until the end of the session, go to the URL that you see on your screen, VEE.am/DPR22. You can download the report, rocket ship it all, and for the most part, even follow along as Dave and I go through the data. You'll see almost all the same charts, actually even a few that won't make the live stream for today. So with that, Dave, certainly one of the macro trends that has shaped Veeam's strategy and is where does the cloud fit in production? Now, this is actually the result of 8,000 IT leaders' feedback over a 3-year endeavor. You want to break that down for us?
Yeah, I appreciate this. Can look confusing or a little busy, I should say, probably more accurately, right at first blush, but it's really not. So what we did going back a couple of years ago in 2020, on the left-hand side, that kind of light green, we asked people in 2020, what are you doing today at that moment with regards to physical servers in the data center there on the left, virtual machines in the data center in the middle, and with VMs going to a hyperscaler managed service provider in the cloud on the right. And then in 2020, we said, what do you think that you're going to do later on? And that trend repeated. Now, because we've been asking this question 3 years in a row, what are you doing today? What do you think you're going to do 2 years from now? We actually have actual data for 2021, 2022, and now 2 years in a row of anticipated data. Last year we said, what are you doing in 21? What are you going to do 24 months from now? This year we said, what are you doing in 2020 or 22? What are you going to do in 24? And Jason, we marveled at this when we got the data back. What incredibly perfect trend lines we see here.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And even in the nuances where the line isn't perfect, actually tells a really interesting story in that 2020's research was actually done just before COVID, right? Just before the global pandemic and the lockdown. And as we've seen so many times before, one of the things that happened in the first several months after the global lockdown was a redistribution of IT, and hybrid and remote workforce became much more prevalent. So we saw an acceleration of IT modernization and hybrid initiatives as organizations were trying to figure out what the new normal was going to look like. And so seeing that there's a gradual line curve in all three cases, but looking at pre-COVID versus post-COVID, and then now looking at a four-year line extrapolation after that, really, really exciting data. And I guess the meta themes that I see here, and Dave backed me up on this, I love the fact that it looks like physical servers and virtual servers, so both of the data center architectures are kind of normalizing around an even balance, 50-50 within the data center, and neither one is going to zero. The data center is not dying, Dave. Can you believe that?
Yeah, and this really starts to put a fine point and prove that the hybrid notion of on-prem and cloud and multi-cloud, it's real. To your point, nothing's going to rise to the exclusion of something else. So if we think about it, it makes sense, right? There's a reason why applications are still running on physical machines. It's maybe a custom application. It's on a special variety of Unix. There's some business critical function that's best satisfied by keeping that deployment. So it's really no reason to prematurely sunset equipment. However, it is exciting that we look at next year where we might actually just go over the halfway mark for now we could begin to see the majority of workloads running in a cloud environment.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, I guess the other nuance that we should probably point out to folks is that I think what you're really seeing here more than anything else is what happens when organizations truly take a cloud first strategy, where the organizations are saying, look, I need to stand up new platforms far faster than I'm decommissioning old platforms. So if it can run in a cloud, let's do that. Right. And so that the result is a dilution, not a destruction, not an end of life, but a dilution of the data center as new workloads that are cloud first are standing up in either a hyperscale or an MSP. All right, so we've got a lot of other strategies we kind of want to unpack from this data, but one of the new questions that was added this year to the survey is just this concept of enterprise backup. Right, we talked about this, Dave, for a long time, 30 plus years for each of us along the way. And it used to be that, enterprise was, what unilaterally meant, well, it must be reliable, must be 100,000 machines, or must be the thing that everyone else in the global 2000 buys or something, right? So we just wanted to ask, right, in 2022, what does the term enterprise backup mean to you? And then following up on that, if your organization was considering a new enterprise backup solution today, what would be the most important attribute? So in this case, what you see here is the long lines are choose all that apply. And then the shorter lines are when you can choose only one. And Dave, we got a couple different cuts on this data that's probably worth talking about. Uh, right now, it's sorted by choose all that applies. So the most common answers are showing up on the top of the list. Interesting trend on those top ones, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It really comes down to workloads, what we see bubbling up there, meaning cloud or modern infrastructure software as a service, traditional enterprise applications like Oracle, SAP, HANA, and then maybe historical traditional data center platforms like network attached storage, file shares, and Unix, but it was really all about the workload.
Yeah, and again, if you download the report, vee.am/DPR22, you'll notice that in the report, what we talk about is really today in 2022, it seems like for many organizations, enterprise is synonymous with heterogeneity, right? Just that diversity of workload. But Dave, let's remix the data. Let's look at it from what's most important as opposed to most common as a synonym for enterprise. And here, the order looks a little bit different, right? Because we resorted that, but it tells a couple macro stories. Shall we go ahead and break those down?
Yeah, so what you see here is it's still that notion of enterprise applications, but we talked about how it's going to be a hybrid world so that those on-prem mission critical apps we see here, but by a pretty wide margin, you can see 21% compared to the next highest at 13 for most impactful are those modern workloads or infrastructure and software as a service.
And for the folks that are thinking about your own IT modernization strategies, I think what I would point out is, remember, these short lines are when the question was asked, if you were buying something new, what would be most important? And what we've often found in talking with customers is that while they have a legacy backup solution, often in the data center for their legacy platforms, as new platforms are being stood up in either IaaS or SaaS, right? And we saw that on the trajectory line going through 2024, that the legacy approaches for backup are inadequate for backing up Amazon and Azure and Google Cloud and Office 365 and Salesforce, and the list just keeps on going. So it would make sense that if you're going to go buy something new, that's where you have the biggest hole. That's where you have the biggest need. Dave, I kind of think the folks got it right on this particular survey question.
Yeah, I would totally agree.
So next trend, what do you got?
So here we shift gears a little bit. If you could say it was about workloads, critical workloads up the top two, now what we really see is it's about characteristics of the solution, meaning management across
Yep,
different locations. And of course, you want that solution to be reliable, but these aren't data constructs like the top ones were. This is really about the experience of the recovery solution.
that's right. So first we covered the what's. Now we're into the hows, right? Is that qualitative experience, easy, reliable, those kind of things that you kind of want out of just about anything that you buy. Now let's do a couple of bit of myth busting, right? So in fact, we kind of alluded to this on the opening question. Dave, you're our resident myth buster. Break these down for us.
Well, I just found it fascinating that if you look at that scale notion of thousands to tens of thousands, or pick your number, historically, if you go back, say 12, 15 years ago, enterprise really did mean more of a lot of things, most number of terabytes or petabytes, or most number of protected devices. And here, that's very, very far down the list. And in fact, it didn't even fare all that well if you could check all the considerations. So a little myth busting on that compared to what we've been led to believe or popularly thought was the case many years ago. The other is when we look at some of these traditional platforms like Unix or NAS, it's not that it's unimportant, but it's just not as supreme of importance as it once was.
Right? That's not going to be what actually drives, I'm going to go buy something new, right? So is it important overall? Yeah, it's right. It's number three. Is it what's going to drive a new purchase? Probably not. But I do really like the fact that that organizations seem to have a clear grasp of the difference between distributed data protection, multi-geo, multi-location, multi-language, versus simply scale for its own sake. Tens of thousands of machines protected per se. So I really like the insights that come out of this, and I think it sets a new bar for what should enterprise look like into 22 and beyond. All right, so that's one of the key areas that we thought were really interesting. Let's look at the next major trend line. Dave, this is one of the ones that you and I, well, I mean, actually probably any backup vendor really wants to know more than almost anything else is, when customers were asked, what would drive your organization to change its primary backup solution to either a new solution or to a new service? That's again, and we have the long lines to the right, and then coupled with that are the shorter lines on what is most important here. And again, this can be a very busy slide, a little overwhelming perhaps. Let's break it down into some macro trends.
Yeah, what we've seen the last couple of years in a row is that either number one or number two has been to improve the reliability or success of backups. And, at first that surprised us a little bit because you would say, is that a kind of an indictment on the current state of the backup market where a top need, a major pain point is to make this more successful? But we somewhat joke, but it's also very accurate that you can't restore that which you haven't backed up. It all begins with a successful backup, so that's very important. Closely related to that, and what's the number one here is I need to improve my service level. as expressed by recovery point or recovery time objectives. So let's take these both in combination, Jason, and we need it to work is really what the public is saying.
That's right. The other thing is that when you think about the shifts that we're seeing in that heterogeneity, that in the physical and the virtual and the multi and hybrid cloud architectures, what we've often seen, in fact, roll the clock back 15 years, when people were first struggling with virtualization, they just said, hey, I'll just put an agent in there, or I'll just snap the array underneath the host. And what they figured out was that was not sufficient. And as we look at what people are trying to do with Amazon and Azure and Google Cloud and Office 365 and Salesforce, and as they get more and more diverse, using old school methods to back up next gen platforms, you're gonna have a lack of good outcome, right? You're not gonna be able to get what you want out of it. And I think that's also exacerbating some of the qualitative improvement that folks are looking for. All right, so that's number one. They want it to work. Number two.
Yeah, here I think it's interesting. It's about the money. And while money didn't rise to the top of the list, at some point it becomes important. And what we see here is actually a few different ways that finances were expressed, either wanting to change your price model, wanting to improve your return on investment or total cost of ownership, or wanting to make improvements on either your software or hardware costs.
Yeah, so economically, we see three different factors, right? So in fact, if you add them up, and correct me on the math here, so 9 and 9 is 18, 7, 25. So 25%, 1 in 4 organizations, the most important thing about changing their data protection solution for 2022 is going to be around economic benefit, right? They want to pay less, get more value. Somehow that works into that. Whereas the top two, the ones we just saw a few seconds ago, 20%, 1 in 5 organizations, they just want it to work better. Right. And then lastly, and I thought this one was really interesting, the idea of diversification, right? And also perhaps more around manageability as a model. So we see an interest in moving from on-prem based backup into cloud-based backup services. I really like the fact that organizations said, hey, I want to diversify the tools, because they recognize that while you might have a single vendor like Veeam that can protect all these workloads, you know, there is a different secret sauce and methodology to protecting Microsoft 365 than there is to protecting even Azure hosted VMs, much less Amazon or Google, different from how you might back up a physical or virtual machine on-prem. So recognizing that each one's going to require some secret sauce, but ideally going to a single vendor so you can have better costs and value, I think makes a lot of sense. And then certainly ease of use. You know, the days of, hey, I'm going to go buy a new backup product and then go to school for 3 weeks and then have professional services come and do all this for me, those days are over. So I like the fact that beyond qualitative improvement in economics, they're just looking for a better set of experiences and recognizing that their needs have evolved.
Yeah, exactly. You know, this is almost a myth-busting notion right here that backup is such a tried and true thing. It's been around for literally over half a century, but it's not the same backup. It's not the same environment, and it's not the same service level expectations.
That's right. Hey, you used the M word again, so let's do that. Let's do some more myth busting. And this is one that perennially you've asked in this life and in the one prior. Walk us through what you saw on the bottom of the list.
Yeah, what's interesting is it was popular for a few years recently to think that the different kind of form factor might really radically influence how people wanted to consume and who they might partner with to provide the protection technologies. And we saw this expressed in both ways, whether that was software only and you could choose your infrastructure. And some people that favored that argument would say, well, Jason, this is great. I can go and get the software of my choosing, and then I can essentially force the resellers and the different hardware vendors to buy for my business. You know, in other words, I might have 3 different disk vendors and they all want to see if they can get the lion's share of the contract next time. So a way to control costs, in other words. There was also a popular opinion that said, you know, Jason, actually what I really want is I just want to unbox something, feed it a power cord and plug it into the network and basically be off to the races. Either one of these actually come out low on the list. It turns out the package experience is not the key notion in terms of framing your decision criteria, your decision making thought process.
Yeah, there's only so much value you get out of a day zero optimization like an appliance, and there's only so much value you get out of just rolling on your own. That's not what really is driving change. All right, so those are some of the top lines of what is driving change. And Dave, you and I have used this analogy before. You do quite a bit of hiking and walking. I'm a scout, so I have to do the occasional hike. And in any hike, you have the idea of where you're coming from and what are you going to. This was the what are you coming from? Why would you change? The other perennial question that we think really defines data protection strategy is looking at where are you going to? So the question was asked, just blanketly, what would you consider to be the defining aspects of a modern or an innovative data management or data protection solution? And again, you've got the long lines, choose all that apply, and the short lines, which is most important. And like in the other cases, we see a couple macro trends. Let me start off on this one because you've been telling all the good parts already. So let me pile on this first one. I love that hybrid is coming out in both protection and production as top of mind for folks. That, our first option on the list is being able to leverage hybrid infrastructure, meaning the cloud extended parts of this for disaster recovery, right? So I don't want to have to pay for a secondary data center. I just want to spin one up when I need it, right? And then similarly, and I think this goes straight back to our first chart, we looked at the healthy mix of physical and virtual and cloud hosted, that organizations would say, I need to have standardized protection of both my on-prem and my IaaS and my SaaS, right? So even though I'm going to use separate tools, we saw that as a method of best practice on the last slide. I still need to have standardization, which leans us back into you better use the same vendor, even if you're using separate SKUs across the way. But Dave, that middle one, that's pretty cool because I think it tells a story that you're not going to get from the migration tool from Amazon or Azure or Google or anyone else. It's not a migration at this point. It's around flexibility.
Yeah, and if we think about the last 2 years, if the global pandemic has taught us anything, it's that we need to be ready, in some cases ready for things that we might not have anticipated or couldn't really easily foresee. And so that flexibility, that notion of I want data portability, I want cloud mobility, I want to maybe develop in one cloud or on-prem and then burst to another cloud, or just the peace of mind to know that down the road, if I make a different decision, that I'm free to do so.
That's right. That's right. So, so cloud bears really heavily in both production and protection when we look at what does modern data protection look like. But there is a second trend that's worth noting, and I'm going to shorthand this as integratability. I'm not sure if that's entirely a word, but what did you see on this one, Dave?
Yeah, well, I was excited by this because what it's really rising recognition of is that backup is no longer something that's off to the side, kind of orthogonal to the rest of IT or even the rest of the business. It's that backup can play a key role and should participate with other kinds of initiatives. Data security strategy, which we will definitely see in a little bit around cyber and ransomware,
Sure.
but as well as broader system management tasks as well. So it's just an idea that backup isn't something that you do, write the data, you never touch it. No one else in the business or even IT cares about that. No, backup is becoming more integrated into the rest of the process.
That's right. This next one I think is really interesting. This is about doing smarter, right? So we see the ability to utilize production data for secondary data purposes. So that's DevOps, that's forensics after a cyber attack, that's patch mitigation, that's OS upgrade, making sure that the old Patch Tuesdays. I spent a couple of years at Microsoft. Patch Tuesday used to be a pretty big deal over there. And then also automation of workflows and orchestration. So humans in general are not good at minutia repetitive tasks. We're just not, right? So instead, let's orchestrate the heck out of those. Let's put those into scripts. Let's put those scripts into orchestrated workflow and then have it consistently test. Computers are really good at repetitive minutia tasks. Humans are not. So what does modern data protection look like? It includes using that data for more than just when stuff breaks, and be smarter about what you do with it, right? Last thing, let's do some myth busting. So again, on this one, again, these are not unimportant. They just may not be indicative of what's perceived as modern, disruptive, or innovative per se. Dave?
Yeah, that's right. And I like your talk track around that notion of moving workloads from on-prem to the cloud. That was different. That was new. That was something out of the norm a handful of years ago. But it's now not something that's unimportant. But to your point, it's viewed as, oh, I think I can get that from a variety of different providers. So because it's not something that I really have to go out of my way to look for, might not be considered a mainstream feature, it's lower on the list. And the same about ability to reduce costs. Of course, costs and consumption models matter, but now there's, I think, a growing perception of there's choice out there in the market. And the old saying, I don't care what it costs if it doesn't fit my needs, certainly comes into play.
That's right. That's right. And Dave, you're more the car guy than I am. I've heard you use many car analogies, but I just can't help but think about, there was a time when automatic transmission was disruptive compared to manual. There was a time when ABS brakes was disruptive compared to manual. There's a time when GPS in the dash was disruptive, right? And now a lot of those things we just think of as, well, most cars should have that, except by exception. I just think that's where these things are as far as the bottom list. Still important to have on the car, just not necessarily something that you would say this is still leading edge.
Right.
All right, so those are kind of the big macro topics that we think are going to be defining and affecting data protection strategy for the majority of 2022 and likely beyond. Let's pick up the pace a little bit and look at a couple of the other major headlines that this year's Data Protection Trends report talked about. One of the ones that as a vendor we were keen to see, 88% of organizations expect to increase their budget in data protection, including both backup and or BCDR, over the next year, and with an average of about a 6% increase in that. Dave, I'm going to make a guess that a large part of that was, I think a lot of folks really invested budget and manpower in modernizing production in 2021, and in many cases, they modernized production faster than protection. And so this year, that investment shift is to kind of catch up. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I really do. And I think, this increase is pretty phenomenal. I mean, the global average, a firm like an IDC would indicate for IT would be sub 3%. So this is double the overall IT average. And I think you're spot on. I think if we even combine some things, we saw people vote that backup needs to integrate with systems management with their security practice. Things like ransomware, certainly people understand that backup's critical for that. And to your point, they probably were very focused on changing their business models, surviving the economic changes that came with the pandemic in the last few years. And now it's time to do, call it good housekeeping, and really the type of best practices, things they may have put off or deferred.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other drivers that we're seeing and why we're seeing that incremental investment is because of a change in perception. As far as how protected are they, or are they protected enough? This is a question that actually Veeam has been asking for several years. One of our founders used to start many of his conversations with this, but at the time he coined this as the availability gap. We padded back onto that later with what we call the protection gap. The availability gap basically implies if you were to go to business leaders and say, hey, IT will occasionally go down, right? Stuff breaks. When it goes down, how long can the business provide function when IT is down, right? And then go next door and ask the IT folks, hey, stuff is going to break. We get it, right? How long does it really take to get back up and running again? And what this year's data shows, and this is actually the biggest gap that we have measured in the 5 or 6 years this question's been part of the report, 90%. 9 out of 10 organizations either agree or strongly agree that there is a gap between how fast applications can be brought back online versus what the business actually requires. 90%. Now, the second question is even simpler. The second question is around, how much data can I afford to lose? And again, 89% say there's a gap between how much can I afford to lose and then just the basics of how frequently do I actually protect the data. Dave, 9 out of 10 in both categories. I think this perception gap and the lack of confidence from the business back to IT, it's fair to say that's probably why some of that investment's happening, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a growing recognition that the systems they have deployed today can't keep up. They're going to take too much time and or lose too much data. And 9 out of 10 are in some cases, a little greater than 9 out of 10 on the affirmative that they have an issue. That's pretty compelling, especially when you consider how many thousands of people globally participated in this research.
That's right. All right, and I think the other reason that we're seeing such angst and anxiousness around these gaps is just because I don't think we've ever been confronted with how dependent we are on the data and how many different challenges there are to ensuring that we get access to the data when we really need it. This particular data actually comes from 2 years of the report, the DPR 2021 report and 22. In the 21 report, we asked where did most of your outages come from in 2020? And oh, by the way, what was the most impactful outage? What did that come from? And then again, a year later, where did most of the outages come from in 2021? And what was the cause of the most impactful outage? Dave, we see a couple macro trends. Let's start with most common. If we look on the lines that lean furthest to the right, you see there's kind of it's a three-way tie plus a couple of rounding errors. It's all around stuff still breaks. 2022, Dave, stuff is still breaking. Is that not amazing?
It is kind of amazing when you consider, we've all invested in, dual redundant power supplies, component failover. We know of improved mean time to failure between the components that we've got. So with redundancy, with reliability increases, you wouldn't think we would have as many things breaking in the data center, but it still happens.
Right. Okay, but that's most impactful. I mean, most common. The data is actually sorted by what's most impactful, 2021 and then 2020. It is amazing to me. Top of the list, cyber. 51% of organizations said they did suffer outages due to a cyber event in 2021. And for the second year in a row, a cyber event was the most impactful cause of an outage, 16% and then 15% respectively in 2021 and 2020. That's kind of scary that we're at the top of the list already.
Yeah, and if I combine these two, you can't help but lose a little faith in humanity, because either accidentally or maliciously, it's the humans that represent the greatest causality.
Yeah, and arguably, so if you have silly users in the number 2 slot, right, deletions, overwrite, etc., and when we know from other data that we've looked at, the most common ways that a cyber event is successful is because somebody was phished, right? Somebody clicked on that link, somebody said, "I wonder what happens if you," and then you see the results of that. So certainly, looking at that causality is a big deal. All right, so I'm looking at the clock, and I want to make sure that we have time for a few other areas. But let's go ahead and wrap up the outage section just by understanding that when stuff breaks, it's not just about that immediate impact of downtime and data loss. There's other things that kind of come out of this. And again, in this case, we've added some extra coloring here because we kind of see 3 trends that comes out of this. Let's unpack these. So the first trend is really around that external exposure, right? So lack of customer confidence, lack of damage to the brand integrity, and then we get into the what would you call this, Dave? Just the internal ramifications of downtime.
Yeah, exactly. I think you nailed it. The lighter bars there at the top, those are external, and then internal, variety of different things. But, you add all that up and the impact is significant, the impact is real. We always like to point out those 3% that said there's really no impact, that was unanticipated. That's hopefully true, but that might be optimistic.
Unicorns and puppy dogs. I can't imagine anyone who actually lives in that world that there's no impact to downtime. But All right. You know what there is impact on, Dave? Digital transformation. Digital transformation can really impact an organization. I know this is an area that you spent a great deal of time on. These are questions that actually got added when we, in the 2021 survey, when we were first struggling with, how is the pandemic really affecting long-term IT strategy? Now that we're in our second year and hopefully coming out the backside of that, we got to ask the question again. As the pandemic starts to recover, how would you characterize digital transformation since the pandemic began? So this is a 2-year curve line. This is kind of exciting, actually.
Yeah, it really is. If you just look at the right-hand side of this, if you add up those that have significantly sped up their digital transformation or DX initiatives and those that have somewhat sped up, that's 72%, better than 7 out of 10. Conversely, when you add up significantly or somewhat slowed down, that only is 8%. 17% were kind of in the middle saying, well, we really didn't change our plans. But a full 72% are actually going further, faster, and they're leveraging data to do it. And it makes sense. They needed to change their business model. There were probably things they wanted to improve anyway. Now was kind of a time where you had to address this, or you could suffer a business loss. Going out of business, losing customers.
So this is where they are in the process and progress. Let's look at what's holding them back.
Yeah, interesting. It feels like, Jason, for decades, literally decades, that in IT, lack of staff, lack of skills has been a major inhibitor from just about every survey you can imagine. But I look at this and I see technical debt on the second one, meaning dependency on legacy systems and technology. So what it could be is that the overburdened staff is now even more overburdened, and or maybe they're just not familiar with digital transformation, and they've got poor tools. They may have been good tools in the past, but they're holding them back now.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk to one of the naysayers, one of those 8% of folks that said nothing's holding us back. In the last case, I think they were delusional. In this case, it's like, man, I want to work for those companies. I want to work for a company where senior leadership is bought in, that time and dollars are being invested so that we can overcome legacy systems, so that we can train our people. Because if we do DX right, there's a huge amount of value that comes out of that.
Yep, exactly.
One of the ways that we've been watching organizations over the last couple of years around their digital transformation strategy, Dave, you and I grew up on mainframe and mid-range, and then the PC server era, right? NetWare and Windows and virtualization era. Even in cloud, there was still this thing that we called a server. The next gen of IT modernization for many folks may not be server centric. So we've been tracking this concept called containers, and how is that going? I should point out that out of the 3,400 respondents, almost 3,393, that were part of the Data Protection Trends 2022 report, 1,300 of the executives said, I know enough about our container strategy, I'll answer these additional container questions too. So admittedly, this was a subset, but 1,300, that's still 4x, Dave, what you would normally see in a generic survey instrument. And out of 1,300 organizations, there's some great numbers here as well.
Yeah, there really are. Just look at the one boundary condition. 0% out of over 1,300 said we have no plans to run containers in production. 56%, over half, are saying that they already do have some container activity in production today. Over a third, at 35%, said not yet, but they're planning to run containers in production. So that's 91% are either in production or plan to be in production with containers. And the remaining 9 say, well, we're not yet running containers in production, but we're interested in doing that. That is about as overwhelming evidence that this has taken off. It's not something in the future, it's happening now.
That's right, that's right. Okay, so good news, containers are making progress. Containers are moving forward. Bad news, not everyone knows how to back them up. So when organizations were asked who is responsible for defining the data protection requirements within your organization, this is kind of an interesting mix. It's nearly 25, 25, 25, 20. It's nearly a four-way tie. I'm going to start off though by pointing out for the 5% of respondents who knew what their organization's container strategy was, but didn't know who was responsible for backup. I got to tell you, that means 5% of those deployments are not being backed up. If you don't know who's doing it, it probably ain't happening. Maybe that's the Texas envy coming out, but I just think that's a problem. But let's look at the other four categories, Dave, because I think this tells a couple of interesting stories that if you used to watch virtualization is kind of reminiscent, a little deja vu.
Yeah, it really is. If you think back before there even was a virtualization administrator, it was typically the server administrator. Eventually, maybe you saw someone that kind of specialized in vSphere or virtualization, and you maybe got some of the storage team involved and maybe some of the backup team involved. So in other words, it was all over the map, and that's exactly what we see here. We see storage people, we see application owners, we see Kubernetes owners, we see the traditional backup team. So I really think this is going to be a point in time statement. This is going to be a great one to watch how it evolves. But four different constituencies are listed here. At some point, that probably doesn't go to one, but four's a few too many. And obviously that 5% that aren't sure who's backing up, I totally agree. If you're not sure, you have to assume that it's not being done. You have to think that I better go investigate that.
Yeah, and let's put a name on a couple of these, right? So if, because I do think there's some danger in this one. So if for folks that are multitasking while they're listening, if you've got containers in your environment, I want you to hear this part. Certainly we over here at Veeam, we love the two boxes on the left, right? Same team that backs up the other stuff also backs up Kubernetes. Totally makes sense to us. And of course, if you're a Veeam customer, you can do that, right? You can, integrate with the Kasten K10 product. You can back that up. If you're a Kasten customer, right, the team that lower left corner manages Kubernetes, is also responsible for backing it up. A lot of the as a service or cloud hosted platforms, we're seeing more and more where those administrators are responsible. And I love that concept too, right? One of the reasons we bought Kasten. I worry for the folks on the right. Right? If the only thing you're doing is snapping the storage, right? I gotta believe the only reason you're doing that, it'd be like only snapping or protecting the disk underneath a VMware set of hosts. It's a great idea until you figure out that you actually don't have enough information to stitch it all back together again. What you have is a couple LUNs and some VMDXs or VHDs, and you wonder why you don't have any servers anymore. Same thing with the apps, right? So apps sit inside of pods, sit on top of a container framework. That is not enough to reconstitute that data set. And so while you might get a green check mark for part of it, if you actually had to start over again, you do not have enough to rebuild. So I worry for that a little bit. You should go check out the blog from our friends over at Kasten to see how they reacted to this particular slide as well. Let's look at a couple other new and upcoming technologies and where this fits. Let's look at where cloud fits within most organizations today. And Dave, we mentioned this at the beginning of the session, but one of the benefits of the Data Protection Trends 2022 report is that it's the third year in a row that we've run it. Some of the questions we ask year over year over year. So like that hybrid IT question we had at the beginning of our session, this is one where we did ask percentage of organizations that were using cloud as part of their strategy, either BaaS, backup as a service, or simply using cloud storage as a complement to their existing on-prem, versus those folks whose data protection solutions were entirely on-prem self-managed. And you got a 60-40 mix, cloud to non-cloud. We asked in 2020, what are they doing? What are they going to do in 22? In 21, we asked, what are they doing? What are they going to do in 23? This year, we asked about 22, and then what are they going to do in 24? And again, the shape of the decline is pretty powerful. 40, 34, 33, 19 plus or minus 2 is 21. I mean, that's a really cool shape, and it tells a really strong story.
Yeah, it really does. It's undeniable, the trend. But at the same time, it doesn't mean on-prem goes to zero. It just means where the new growth is coming from, where new applications are going to, is very cloud-based. And what we see in the next year is we look like we're going to make a pretty major jump. We've been on that trend, but it's going to accelerate.
Yeah, and at some point we should probably add the third color back in, because there is actually an interesting blending in the mix that's going on right now between just using cloud as a storage repository and where backup as service or managed service of data protection starts to become even more interesting and more commonplace as the years progress. And so I think that'll also be the interesting trend is, hey, you're going to get your data out of the building. It's going to go into cloud, but who's going to manage that instance for you? I think will be an interesting topic of evolution. And that's going to bring us to our other cloudy topic on this. In this case, looking not just at backup, a repository that's out of the building, but really around leveraging that secondary infrastructure that is now cloud hosted. And that could be Azure, Amazon, Google Cloud as just infrastructure on demand. As a service when you need a DR site for when something bad happens. It could certainly also be disaster recovery as a service, DRaaS providers as well. Dave, the bottom of the list is pretty consistent, right? So if you have 2 data centers, keep them.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've made that investment, there's no reason to prematurely turn that off. Get as much operational life as you can out of it. And frankly, if you've got that, you're in a luxurious situation. But the most of us, we don't have secondary data centers, or at least we don't have enough secondary location to handle all of our workloads. So that's where the cloud enters.
That's right. Now let's talk about what the cloud does, right? So 23 to 30 to 36 to 51 to 53. Right. I think there's actually 2 drivers why organizations ought to be excited about how disaster recovery and the cloud complement each other. Certainly the one we've already talked about is that elastic nature of secondary infrastructure, right? So yeah, you're going to pay for cloud storage to have a copy out there when you need it. But being able to actually spin up all that CPU to dynamically then create the networking to get back up and running, to have a secondary site when you need it, and otherwise just have survivable data. Certainly the economics of that is really interesting, particularly for commercial accounts and small and mid-sized businesses. All of those accounts are just as dependent on their data as large enterprises, but large enterprises had the luxury of multiple data centers and commercial and below did not. So I think certainly giving them a secondary data center is a huge advantage. The other thing though that I think DRaaS in particular provides is access to expertise, right? Having those BCDR experts that you can't afford to have on your staff, but they could be there from a DRaaS provider. They can help you architect up front. They'll be there when you hit that panic button, when everything goes south. I think expertise is just as interesting as that elastic infrastructure. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that that's where the growth in the BCDR market is coming from.
Well said.
All right, speaking of BCDR, right? We talked a lot about the concerns around cyber. We talked a lot about, that, cyber events, 51% had outages caused by cyber, most impactful outage causality, 2nd year in a row. One of the questions, Dave, that all these last ones are from new sections, but one of the ones we are most keen to find out is, it used to be there was such separation within IT. The backup folks were over in this cubicle and the networking folks were on a different floor and storage was in the basement in a cubicle. They had different goals depending on where they were along the way. So we wanted to find out how aligned are cyber strategies and arguably cyber teams within the overall organization's business continuity disaster recovery strategy. And I love the fact that 0 said not integrated. I love the fact that 88%, 7 out of 8 orgs, said their cyber strategies were either completely or mostly integrated into their BCDR strategy. Dave, I think they got it right, and I think that speaks well to the fact that most organizations understand ransomware is a disaster.
Yeah, exactly. Fully agree. This is actually really reassuring news to see the progress we're making here.
Which is good, because it turns out the bad guys are making progress too. Dave, walk us through it.
Yeah, we've been hearing that ransomware is on the rise for quite some time, but this data really proves it. So this is a simple question: has your organization suffered an attack in the last 12 months? 24% said no, although Jason and I wonder, maybe the person that responded just didn't have complete awareness or visibility. We'd like to think, though, that perhaps almost 1 out of 4 didn't actually suffer any kind of successful attack, but we have reason to believe that may not entirely be the case. But that aside, look as we go from that left to right, how many organizations had not just 1, 2, 3, but we've got a significant number really at 16%, or I'm sorry, no, that's right, 16% had 4, 5, 6, or more than 6 attacks in just 12 months. It's something that's really definitely on the rise. Bad actors are getting even worse.
That's right. That's right. And I don't know what else to say to that one. Just, it's getting worse as a prevalent problem. So love the fact that the strategy is starting to align. And that's one of the reasons why you hear backup vendors like Veeam talking about ransomware holistically, and while we're building features in the product specifically designed to help remediate against that. That's especially important because, especially if you're using like a legacy backup solution, one of the questions was asked, and it's worth pointing out, by the way, that this entire survey, this is an unbiased set of organizations. These are not Veeam customers or any other vendor that we know of per se. We actually do ask, hey, what's your primary backup solution? But as a global number, when organizations were asked, thinking about their most significant ransomware attack over the last 12 months, what percentage of their data were they able to recover? And this is really ugly. On average, an organization will only be able to recover 64% of their data. That basically inverts as, check my math, Dave, 36% data loss from an attack. I think Dave is dumbstruck, or my connection's been lost. I'm not sure which is which.
I think it's both. I think I am completely dumbstruck. And, I think the notion here, that's the average, 36% loss. But look at how 1 out of 14 are going to experience 80% data loss. And this is despite what no doubt were heroic efforts by the entire IT staff, probably the vendors that were supplying them, perhaps even professional services. So after they did everything they can possibly do, too much data was lost.
That's right. That's right. All right. I think we've got just one more chart to kind of finish our timeout for today. We got about 6 minutes left. That'll also mean that if you have any questions, make sure to throw those in as well. You're welcome to do that. But this last thing, we talk a lot about BCDR and how do you remediate from that. It's a little concerning to me that when organizations were asked, how are you going to fail over or fail back? Only 1 in 4 organizations actually use orchestrated workflows today. Actually, what concerns me is not that. I'd love that number to be higher because that's smart. What I worry for is the 29%, that lime green in the upper right-hand corner. 29% actually think that the original subject matter experts who built this environment are going to show up for work during that fire, that flood, whatever that crisis is, and they're going to manually reconstruct their infrastructure while their CFO standing behind them asking when's it going to be up again. I just think that's insane.
Yeah, this is really, boy, talk about putting faith into maybe a low probability event. That 29% that said, well, we'll just kind of build it from scratch. We'll go find manuals. We'll go locate the download sites for some of our ISO images. That's, very concerning because this is the worst possible time in a huge event, which is a disaster that could potentially have infected all of your systems and affected all of your data, and you're going to go searching for things. Same with scripts. Scripts can be brittle, or more likely, scripts contain the best practices and logic of the person or people that wrote them, which could be years ago for an environment that really doesn't look like what's deployed today.
That's right. That's right. And that's not even just the 3-ring binder kind of scripts, right? Even if you just made a batch file the day that you deployed the app, those things don't get tested. And if they don't get tested, I guarantee there's going to be flaws with them. One of the things I love best about workflow, especially orchestrated workflow, is the fact that you can test with exactly the same button that that your crisis will eventually invoke. Test the same way that it's kind of like, you practice your sport the same way that you're going to go on the field on game day, right? Same intensities, same plan, same tech. Speaking of tech, let's kind of wrap up. We got about 4 minutes left, and I don't see any questions yet, but it's worth plugging into folks that you know, hopefully now that you've seen the data, now that you see how hybrid everything is, that's why Veeam is not just the virtualization backup company. It's actually where the name Veeam comes from, right? VM, where we started. So certainly our 11A product covers all the physical and the virtual. Orchestration, we just got done talking about how important orchestrated workflow is. Veeam Disaster Recovery Orchestrator version 5 has been out for a couple months now and has some fantastic capabilities. Even more are coming for that. All three of the major hyperscale providers, and then certainly we've talked about the preeminence of containers in many IT strategies today. That's why Veeam bought Kasten. All right, Dave, we don't have any questions left, so let's wrap up with our final slide, and just encourage folks to download the report. Right, so there's a lot of data in the overall report. Please download that while you're when you can. VEE.am/DPR22. Dave, last thoughts, my friend.
Yeah, I just encourage, a quick shout out to Bruce. It said, awesome production. Thanks for the info. So thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. And I would encourage everyone, I think you owe it to yourself to skim this report. This is the largest ever in the history of the industry. It can be useful for self-assessing what your situation is, or having a conversation with other parts of the business about why you may want to be investing, doing some things a little bit differently. Very easy download. VEE.am/DPR for Data Protection Report 22. Be sure to check it out.
And thanks for watching.